Good evening. On behalf of the Castroville Conservation Society, I wholeheartedly welcome you to our journey forward. I'm Martha Ortiz, the current president of the Board of Directors. Chartered in July 2000 as a nonprofit 501c3 corporation, the Castroville Conservation Society was formed to support and encourage the preservation of Castroville's unique history, architecture, archaeological, and natural sites. Through our membership dues, donations, and our yearly Christmas Candlelight Home Tour fundraiser, the Society has contributed to many local projects, which have included the restoration of the windows in the historic Castroville City Hall, the display barn next to Steinbach House, the project at the Castro Colony Living History Center, most recently the log cabin, the restoration of the log cabin. The CCS also provided handmade quilts and curtains, as well as new shutters for the landmark Inn State Historical Site. Membership in the CCS is open to all who are interested in our mission to keep Castroville historic. We hold one membership meeting in May and a historic preservation workshop in August. If you did not find a brochure and membership invitation on your seat, please see one of us after the seminar. All support is greatly appreciated. Now it is my honor to present our fine mayor, Darren Schroeder.
Hi, everybody. So I hope that you like the layout a little bit better. Thank you for the Castroville Conservation Society for, they helped us find a lot of the things that we could do better, many opportunities for improvement, so thank you very much. That's been really great. I hope this works out better for you. A couple of housekeeping items really quickly. First, thank you for coming. This has been quite a journey that we've embarked on, and it's so crucial that you're a part of this. City Council has some things that we're going to have to decide, and we need your input with this. We need your participation with this. This is something that we're going to be doing together. All right, so let's get into it. I'm going to talk too much, and Kathryn's not going to have near enough time to go through her brilliance. So I wanted to remind us, why are we here at all? So what is this? Why are we even doing this? I mean, it's fun to get together. It feels kind of like a good history happy hour, and I always love getting together with you guys. But this actually has a purpose. A few months ago, we've been faced with a lot of growth. There's a lot of people that want to build here. It's a very desirable place, and we realized that Castroville is not growing, but San Antonio is. San Antonio is growing from Castroville, and we don't want to grow as San Antonio. Not that there's anything wrong. I mean, San Antonio is a fine city. I just don't want to live there. And I don't want them to live here. And I think that's the general sentiment. If we're going to grow, let's grow as Castroville. Let's grow as the community that we are. So this is an attempt to figure out, what does that mean? How do you actually accomplish that? We had Bryce that came in, thank you very much, from Rampage Law. I can never remember all of the partners on there, so I'm not going to massacre that. He came in a few months ago, and he's a city planner. He's like, tell me what you want us to do. We'll give the developers direction. Do you want wider streets? Do you want special street lamps? Do you want special street signs? What do you want? And I'm like, we can't answer that. That's not what we do. We could guess at it. We could say, yeah, sure, that sounds good. But we didn't know the implications of that, and we are definitely not qualified to make those kind of decisions. So I wanted to make sure that council had the chance to get educated on what are the implications of these different things that we're going to have to decide. And then I realized we can't just have it as something that council goes through. It can't just be an education process for council, because what's wrong with that, they're all representatives of you, but they're not you. So I wanted to make sure that this was a thing that we went through as a community. so that you knew what we were looking at. You saw the things that we saw. You understand, you have some context to some of the decisions that we'll have to make, and most importantly, you have input. You have the ability to be a part of the process and make sure that you have a voice in this and that you can actually do something with this. Henry Castro, when he came out here 178 years ago, our Founders Day, by the way, is this Saturday, 10:30 at September Square. Little plug for the Alsatian chapter of the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, 10:30 at September Square. So the 3rd of this month is the anniversary of Henry Castro coming here. Henry Castro was incredibly purposeful in what he did here. He brought in a city planner to lay out the wonderful city that we have here. He brought in artists and artisans. He brought in stonemasons that have built a lot of the original homes here and throughout the hill country. He knew that this was something that deserved to be done. This was his namesake. This is something that deserves to be done right. And so they were very purposeful in absolutely everything that they did. And we, as stewards, need to be equally as diligent about being purposeful, doing things for a reason. If you fail to, what was the Jack Welch, take control of your destiny or somebody else will? So this is us taking control of our destiny together. Why are we here today? So last week, we heard from Steve Ube, and I still never quite get his name completely right. Steve, if you haven't gotten a chance, we do have the recording online. He's an Alsatian from Louisiana, the Louisiana chapter of the Alsatian. I don't know, there's a joke in there. I missed that, though. But he was quite charming. It was really, really long, but it was a lot of detail. And so he talked to us about, I think basically what he talked to us about was that we have this really incredible Alsatian sausage with a great recipe. Why would you want to change that recipe? And unlike the Alsatian sausage, this is a secret I think that we need to share. I think this is a recipe that we need to share with the people that are coming here. Because the people that are coming here to grow in Castroville, the people that are investing money, are not like the ones that originally came here. The ones that originally came here built it for themselves and their descendants. The people that are coming in now, they are in business. They are going to build something that makes them money, and they have all right to do that. That is the American way. But they think about it in terms of short-term gains. They think about it as, we're going to make some money, and we're going to do it here. It's a great place. They've all been really good about asking us, what do we want? And we haven't been able to tell them quite exactly what. And so this is an opportunity for us to learn what it is, to give them guidance, because they have all asked for it. If we do nothing, they're going to build what is cheapest and most cost-effective for them. It will make them the most money. They'll cover up all the land, and it'll be done. Whatever happens right now is here for our lifetimes and for generations. So we have one chance to get this right. We may be too late for some, but we're going to, the best time to plant a tree is 30 years ago and today, so we're starting today. The reason that we are here today, specifically, with Kathryn O'Rourke, she is, and I'm going to mess this one up too, she is an architectural historian. Did I get that right? Wow, man, I've been practicing that. So she is from Trinity University. Somebody asked me, why are you bringing in San Antonians to tell you how not to be San Antonio? I'm like, because they know the difference. So I think this is actually going to be one of our more controversial things, because there are people that know this, they love this. One of the reasons that that the city partnered with the Castroville Conservation Society is because part of their entire being is making sure that they're protecting our heritage. This is about us as a city trying to figure out how to change as little as possible. And we're really good at that. Not changing. We're decent. So we are going to try and do that. And she's going to talk to us about what it is, what's in the recipe for Alsatian sausage. She's not actually going to talk about that because she doesn't know. She knows that it's delicious, but she'll talk to us about what is the recipe of Castroville. Steve did that a little bit on a design scale, on a city scale, and she'll talk about it on an architectural scale. She'll explain to you what vernacular architecture is. And Kyle says I need to be quiet and let Kathryn talk because she's the interesting one. So thank you very much. Please join me in welcoming Kathryn O'Rourke.
thank you so much, Mayor Schroeder, and thank you all for having me, for coming together. I can't tell you how exciting it is to be here and to know that you are embarking on this process. There are so many places that don't care about what they look like or who they are or who they become. And here you all are, this room full of people to talk about the place that you live and to think about the future. And I'm really touched, honestly. This is what I wish people did all over the country, and you're doing it right here. And I thank Darren Schroeder for your leadership, right, and to the Conservation Society as well for being part of that, and all of the partners who are making this night happen. I do have a little connection to Alsace. My grandmother's family came to Texas through Galveston. They're from a little town called Croute, which is just really super tiny place. And about 10 years ago, my husband and I were in Europe, and we were able to go and see the town, and there I am 10 years ago. And so for this reason, I have felt a little extra special connection to Castroville beyond what is wonderful about Castroville, of course, on its own. When we were in Croute, we went through the cemetery, right? It's always fascinating to go to cemeteries and historic towns. And my grandmother's family name was Arnold, right? And I have to say, I was sort of floored to walk through the cemetery and see all of these Arnolds and to see how far back they go into the 19th century, these graves, how many had died in World War I, and to feel this sense of connection, and also then to begin to look at the landscape as you see a little bit there in the photograph on the left, and be reminded just a little bit, of course, of the Texas Hill Country. I grew up in Houston, but I went to camp here in the, well, not here, north in the Hill Country, and now, of course, have the pleasure of living in San Antonio. And the sense of sadness, right, that I think that I feel coming back to see the Hill Country and what has happened there is part of what gives me hope for what you all are doing here, right, that it doesn't have to be like some of the things that we've done elsewhere here. I also am excited for you because you've already come so far on this journey. You have a National Historic District that's on the National Register. You have the Conservation Society. There have been a series already of historic plans, and it shows me that this is a community that knows how to get it done, right? That takes action. And again, that's a great place to be in. And just to follow up a little bit about what the mayor was saying, I think there's something to be said about being gentle, right, as you go forward, and to slow the process down, as I think you're trying to do a little bit, and to take advantage of whatever time you have to really be deliberate about where you go. I know that this love continues, right? You have books, and this is, of course, the publication of Rob Zeibel, right? The photographer taking pictures of the historic photos and taking historic photos as well as new ones. All things, again, that form the basis, right, for a really firm future here. As you probably know, and I want to emphasize here, I don't feel like I'm here to tell you what to do. I'm here to tell you what I see and to maybe give you some ways of thinking about how you might go forward. You know this is a special place, and you don't need San Antonians or anyone else to come and tell you that. Nevertheless, it's always interesting to see and to hear about how people in other times and other places have responded to the places that we live and love, right? Frederick Law Olmsted, of course, was the great landscape architect, and he came and traveled through Texas, wrote this famous book, A Journey Through Texas, and he stayed here in Castroville, and he said of the Tarde Hotel, "The best inn we saw in the state. How delighted and astonished many a traveler must have been on arriving from the plains at the first village to find not only his dreams of white bread, sweet meats, and potatoes realized, but napkins, silver forks, and radishes, French servants, French neatness, French furniture, delicious French beds, and the courrier d'état uni, and the more lively and entertaining bourgeoisie," right? So we have this image of Castroville as this like jewel, this sort of gem out in the midst of this journey through this dusty place in the 1850s, and this kind of sanctuary. That's 1859. In the 1930s, the Historic American Building Survey comes through when it's doing its survey of historic buildings all over the United States and photographs the Tarde Hotel. That's when these photographs are from the 1930s. So there's this sense, right, and we'll talk about this more, of the ongoing importance of this place, right? Mayor Schroeder framed this evening and asked me to think about the question in terms of what is the architectural style of Castroville? And I think that's a very interesting starting point, but I want to maybe ask some questions even about the question as we go forward here. Another person, right, another pair of people who came through Castroville in the early part of the 20th century, who really admired what they saw, who knew this was a special place, began to take a crack at describing what was so special about this town. And these were the architects David Williams and O'Neill Ford. Part of why Castroville is important from my vantage as an architectural historian, as someone who is very interested in the 20th century architecture of the Americas, is how foundational it seems to have been for their work. They are architects who go on to be very important in the 20th century. This is what David Williams writes about Castroville in 1928. All right, and it's illustrated, his text is illustrated with these drawings drawn by a very young O'Neill Ford at this point, traveling with him. And it says here, all right, the others here, these drawings are in Castroville, a little village which still has the spirit of the Count de Castro who built it, and of the early 40s, that's the 1840s, before gingerbread and jigsaw things and bungalows were born. Dropping into Castroville is finding peace. A weight is lifted from your soul. For here you are free from the strident discord of the multitudes of false forms and lines and colors that scream at you from almost every angle of our modern streets. Castroville is quiet. Each house is interestingly different from its neighbors, but still they are alike in friendliness of color and form. They are in good taste, for they sit quietly and make no noisy clamor after attention. They have done this for 90 years, but they are fresher and younger than our 10 or 15-year-old bungalows whose gingerbread, that's the decoration that's applied to it, is falling off and whose sheet metal decorations are already rusting away. Castroville is quiet. It is peaceful. It is friendly. A weight is lifted from your soul. These are qualities that don't neatly fit into some stylistic word, right? They are more about what it's like to be here, right? And this is what was so compelling to Williams when he came through. And I have to say, I think I felt even a tiny bit of this arriving in town this evening, this sense of, oh, here I am in a different place. And it is calmer, and it is nicer, and it is lovely, right? And so you still have it, okay? The drawings by Ford gives us some sense of it, and of course, he already, as a young architect, has a great eye and is looking around and is going to see these buildings and say, oh, ooh, look at these elements, look at what I'm going to focus on here, these balconies, and of course, the famous roof lines, which you all know very well. The question of Castroville's relationship to Alsace, again, I think is very, very interesting, of course, and fascinating. This is a photograph that I took in Croûte when I was there. And again, many of you probably know this already, that one of the visual languages, and architects and architectural historians sometimes talk about visual languages. One of the visual languages of Castroville is, of course, the single-story house, right? Stone with whitewashed walls, a pitched roof. Again, in the tradition of Alsatian architecture, these pitched roofs, of course, in the first instance to keep off snow, and here, of course, rain, right? Simple wooden shutters, simple wooden doors, and indeed, relatively small openings, right? The fenestration, the openings of the windows and walls are fairly small. But of course, there are many other buildings in Castroville that don't quite look like the example that I just gave you, right? The log cabin, of course, and then here's an example, and what do these two have that the other one didn't, of course? porch, right? And that's how you know you're in Texas, right? Because we need porches here, right? The addition of the porch is part of what also makes some Castroville houses so distinct, and is part of this process of change that I think is part of what makes the town lovely, and also makes it a little bit hard to say, oh, this is what a Castroville house looks like, period, right? Nevertheless, the one-story house with the gabled roof and the porch has become maybe the dominant image of the Castroville house. And I just love that your city seal, I assume this is in fact the city seal, has a building on it, right? And a really recognizable building. That's another sign to me about how important this place is to you. And when I was walking in Castroville recently, I came across this, which I have to say on the right, sorry, I think there's a pointer here. Yeah, there we go. On the right, and of course you all know what that is, right? What is that? That's a Studebaker. Yes, good. And around the Studebaker is what? In our next lecture, we'll talk about cars. Around the Studebaker is what? What is that thing, of course? It's a carport, right? Which is like this amazing Texas type, right? The carport, okay, which I sort of love. And it is an example, and we're going to talk about the V word here, right, of the kind of development of vernacular architecture. That is an architecture that is perhaps not designed, buildings that are not designed by a professionally trained architect, not someone necessarily who went to school, but an architecture that is created by builders, right, and is often highly responsive to site and to materials, which we'll talk about much more. The 20th century vernacular of Castroville is the Alsatian carport, which I just, you know, my postmodernist sense loves. All right, the Joseph Carl House and Store, of course, one of your major buildings here from around 1850, also beloved and caught the attention, of course, of the surveyors of the Historic American Building Survey in the 1830s, and you see it there. And it is particularly consequential, as it turns out, for David Williams, who will go in the 1930s and at a sort of high point in his career designed the Elbert Williams, no relation to him, house in Dallas. And this is a house in Dallas that seems quite clearly inspired by the Joseph Carl store with, sorry, here, I'll get that, there we go, with the upper level gallery there, right, with that porch, of course, a prominent chimney, and the stepped, gabled roof line, and the of course, shutters and windows there. Williams will, maybe more than anybody else in Texas in the first half of, or the first third of the 20th century, talk about the importance of looking at historic buildings as a source of inspiration for how. Microphone? Better? Back? Okay. Good. All right. And as I mentioned already, O'Neill Ford, it's really hard for me to imagine that he wasn't thinking about the landmark inn and what he had seen here in Castroville when he goes to design La Villita in San Antonio in 1939, right? That's part of what is in the background, and that, you know, maybe we need to stop saying that Castroville looks like La Villita. We don't ever say that anyway, but that La Villita looks like Castroville, perhaps, right? Okay, and of course the houses there. That this becomes a kind of type, a kind of model, right, for what architecture by European settlers looks like in this part of the state. All right, and then just going one step forward. O'Neill Ford becomes really nationally and internationally famous when he designs Trinity University. And the photographs that I'm showing, it's cut off there on the top of the slide there, but this was the cover up here of one of the major architectural journals from the 1950s. And Trinity is published in these national journals. And you can see that he, here again, I think, maybe thinking about this upper level gallery, is going to adapt that in the design of the first building at Trinity, which no longer stands, but it was one of the famous lift slab buildings, which was such a big deal at the time. But this notion that what happened here in Castroville around 1850 is still relevant and is still informing architecture in 1950, right? And in a way that is nationally and internationally significant is, again, part of what's important here, and part of your, I hope you will take that as a source of energy going forward as we start to even think about 2050. Of course, again, Castroville is full of variety, as Williams recognized early on. You have buildings that, of course, look nothing like the traditional Alsatian house that appears on your mailbox. I love the example of the double house. Right there, you have a lot of double houses here with these doors. That in its own way is a delightful type. This is a more sort of Greek revival style building with its porch there. And of course, one of the actually rather few Fachwerk houses, right, that is in Castroville as well. And again, just to kind of keep the conversation or the images perhaps flowing, your churches, same institution, but different buildings, of course, over time will change from very modest and very beautiful, I think, simple stone structures here of 1846 to St. Louis Cathedral Church, which is really a very impressive Gothic revival church of 1870. And so again, just in the span of about 30 years or so, you see this kind of change. My point in showing you these images of buildings that you all know very well, of course, is to get us thinking about variety, right? To get us thinking about multiplicity, right? The multiplicity of forms, of colors, of textures, and what architects and architectural historians call building types, right? The type of the house, the type of the church, the type the meeting hall or the civic center like this. I love this building. It looks nothing like an Alsatian house, right? This was the butcher's building originally, I believe. Is that right? Fabulous brick building from 1910. Absolutely wonderful craftsmanship. And you see, of course, these segmental arches, which are so typical of a lot of the great brick buildings here in this part of Texas, and this marvelous sort of mission revival gable there on the front. That stands side by side an Alsatian house without a porch, right? Suddenly we're back talking about that form, and then go just a few steps forward and a few decades in time, and we come to the City Hall, which of course is a much bigger building from the 1930s, but sits there with those other two buildings, I think very harmoniously, despite the great differences, right, in scale. And it's also, particularly on this facade, a work of really lovely detail and variety in your materials. You have stone and brick and, of course, glass there in the windows. O'Neill Ford said of Castroville, "There were no monuments and no foolishness, but it wasn't dour either. The baker's house was the same size as the judge's house. It was just beautiful." I think that he loved the sense of tranquility and perhaps even humility, if we can say something like that, with respect to this idea that the baker and the judge live in comparably sized houses. That there is a sense, and Ford admired this tremendously in many different contexts, of a kind of simplicity, right, as a value of the place and perhaps of the community. That it need not be overscaled or overwrought. All right, so with these ideas and images and forms in mind, what I would maybe ask us to ask is less about style than about what Castroville is and what is its architectural character, which is distinct from style. What makes Castroville Castroville? Castroville is a town on the Medina River. It is a town on the Medina River. I would say that its character comes from its buildings' human scale, the craftsmanship in the buildings, its materiality, the building's materiality, the ways in which the builders, the architects, expressed materials and used a palette of exterior materials. The buildings are notable, I think, for the ways that the craftsmen and builders handled the relationship of windows to wall surfaces, the variety that we've talked about, and also the proximity of different kinds of buildings one to the next and the multiplicity of uses. Okay, and we'll talk more about what all of these mean. All right, so Castroville is a town on the Medina River. You have one of your greatest resources, of course, as you all know very well, is this river. And I have to say, I am struck. I went down there several weeks ago, as I am anytime I get on the edge of one of these great Texas rivers in this part of the state. by the tranquility, by the calm, and by the beauty, right? And of course, that has to do with the trees and the green water and the instant coolness that we feel there, especially in August, compared to what you feel when you're up on the bank. And so that when you think about the future of Castroville, I hope you will start with the site, right? Mayor Schroeder mentioned this. Henry Castro stopped here for a reason, okay? And I think that was probably because of this river. That notion, and of course human beings have always stopped where they have stopped because of resources, and quite often reverse, right? That we think about site and landscape and ecology as we go forward here. And you have a wonderful park and a really fabulous piece of land by the river that perhaps could be even more special, even more beautiful, even bigger, perhaps. And all of us, of course, in the state have been living in drought, right? Which is possibly going to be more a part of our future going forward as well, right? And that any conversation about architecture, at least in my view, when I think about the long history of architecture, is concerned with nature, with resources, with how human beings live with the earth. Henry Castro, as you heard, as you know, invited planners here, and he got a grid, which is a great thing. I'm a big fan of the gridded town. It doesn't happen by accident. The grid is always a sign of intention and of planning, and they tend to make for really great cities. And so I would say, again, as you think about what is important about Castroville, what makes it special, and what you might want to really try to hold on to is that grid. I think honoring the grid and defining the town go together, right? And what that means is that as growth happens, it happens in a way, and maybe you heard about this some last week, I don't know, but in a way that thinks about the character of Castroville again as a gridded town with straight streets and with squares. Squares, of course, bring us to this question of open spaces and the character of open spaces. In Houston Square, I see a lot of opportunity, right? You have got one of your great centers, of course, with the church and some of the most important historical buildings in the city, and you have a big, giant, actually quite heavily paved section of the city. And when you think about what the future might be, I think it pays to think about starting at this center, insofar as this is one of your centers, and how it relates to the grid and to the edge, right, to the edges of your town. There's, of course, a detail or another view of it you know very well. Opportunity right there. And I don't know what it should be. You have to decide, right? This is why these plazas are so important and so powerful, because they are traditionally great civic spaces for parks or plazas or something else, right? And this is one of the few historic squares in a Texas town that does not have its courthouse or a big municipal building dropped down in the middle of the square. So that's a kind of maybe advantage and opportunity. When you're thinking about the grid and this town, again, to the extent that it is possible, and I know the clock is running fast on this, right? Think about open land at the edge. Part of what makes or will make Castroville continue to feel like a distinct place is a sense of arrival, right? That it's not just this thing, this place in the midst of all of this suburban development. And that means that to the extent that you possibly can, creating an edge, and if at all possible, letting it be green, right? Let those fields be there. We have a concept of a green belt, which again is very hard to do in the United States for a variety of reasons, but cities in Europe have and some parts of the US have created them as a kind of boundary. As you build in town and make development part of it, right? Not subdivisions that are dropped off to the side, right? That more likely than not, if you don't tell them what to do, will give you curving, winding streets, and they won't be gridded. Scale. Scale, scale, scale. Scale is one of the things that is the very most important in architecture, I think, right? What is scale? Yeah. Relative size, yes, exactly. It is relative size. It is relative size. Scale is relationship. And that is part of why it is so powerful, because when we're talking about great towns and great spaces, we're talking about relationships, right? Relationships between buildings and between land and between streets, and most importantly, relationships among people, right? Relationships among people. And one of the things that architectural historians tend to believe is that how we build, how we shape the places we live is a reflection, maybe the highest reflection, of our values as a society, as a culture. It reveals to the world who we are, what we believe in, and how we want to live. And scale has a huge role in all of this. All right, so relative size, that has to do, of course, with building height. And you've all experienced this, right? The difference in the way you feel between walking next to a 1 or 2 or 3 story building versus a 15-story building, right? You feel smaller the bigger the building is, right? Okay, that's one piece of it. That's not the only thing. The other part of scale that's so important is the relationship of the building to the street to the sidewalk. And this is where width matters so much, right? How wide your streets are, how wide your sidewalks are, how wide the sidewalk is relative to the street, right? And then how close the buildings come to the street. One of the things about the historic buildings of Castroville, of course, in part because they were built before cars, is that they come really close to the street, right? The front yard is not a thing in the 1850s, okay? And that's part of what makes the streets great and makes the scale feel walkable and habitable. Again, just a European example, this is very, very typical, of course, in older cities. And in some cases, you see the buildings come really right up close to the street. There's this very, very narrow sidewalk. In some cases, they're wider. Usually, of course, the wider the sidewalk, the more comfortable that is for the pedestrian. But again, I can't give you a precise formula, right? This is something that has to be worked out as you think about the town and how it might grow and change. And then just 2 more examples here. Very narrow sidewalks in its own way, I think, though, very, very pleasant, right? Because you can kind of shop and look in, and then you can have buildings that there, of course, come right to the street, as we've been saying. All right. Highway 90 is a problem, right? Okay, yes. I can't even begin to imagine the kind of conversations that you all might have with TxDOT, but I hope that you will have them at some point, right, when the time comes. Because, of course, the experience out here is of a giant set of spaces for cars rather than for people, right? And you all know this, and that's part of why it feels like this big sort of gash, right? Oh, there we go. Still on? Yeah, good. Okay. Signage, interestingly, is another piece of the story and is something very specific to think about. You know very well that that Shell and that subway could be anywhere, anywhere, anywhere. That's in Castroville, right? And it's a small point, but it is something that you have the power to regulate and dictate, right? In terms of the size, the color, the typeface, where it goes, all of these sorts of things. So to kind of pull together this part of the conversation, I would say, going forward, think about encouraging commerce to cluster on central interior arteries, not on edges, right? To kind of grow the town from the inside out, even as you are protecting the borders and the edges. Make rules about signage, and maybe conceive of what you're doing here as about roadside Texas rather than an interstate exit. And I'm sure you all appreciate that difference, right? We have this great tradition of roadside architecture in this state. We have cars. They're not going to go away. There are going to be changes, but we're going to have them for a long time, right? And just think about how we can make it more like roadside Texas. All right. When we talk about craftsmanship and materiality and walls and windows and variety, this is about building. This is about getting the best building materials, the best structure, really to the greatest extent that you can, trying to ask builders, developers, architects to follow what the best builders of the 19th and early 20th centuries did. That means the buildings might be more expensive, right? Okay? It means buildings that are well built. And again, I think part of what Williams and O'Neill Ford admired so much about Castroville was the way in which the structure of the building was revealed on the outside. That is, that a building that is supported by bricks looks like brick on the outside, not a whole big, set of wooden sticks that are then covered in brick, for example, okay? Yes, the stucco covers the stone. That's part of your tradition. That is perhaps a kind of dishonesty, but it works, right? It's part of your vernacular. And you have, of course, in the church, this really beautiful, beautiful ceiling, right? This revealed structure there. This amazing wooden set of beams that is so much, in fact, to my eyes, as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about 20th century architecture, a great example of rational construction and expression. And we have it even here in buildings like this, right, which has been so beautifully renovated. So to the extent that these are values and specific things that you can carry forward, right, and ask of others who are going to build here to do, I think that you should. Again, variety as well. In the palette of materials on the buildings in some cases, right, there's fabulous color contrasts in this particular example with the shutters, right, the contrast of the wood there with the stucco, and then of course the amazing interiors that you have here also. All right, so what we're talking about as we think about the future really is a set of questions about context, right, which is a word that architects use in a variety of ways, but for our purposes, I would like you to think about context really around the question of how new buildings relate to old ones and how do new buildings contribute to the character of a place. And again, just to sum up, we've talked about scale and materials, forms like those roof lines, patterns, building types, textures even, particularly as they're carried in materials, rhythms, and also distinctive architectural elements. And a distinctive architectural element in Castroville might be something like the porch, right? Okay. There are many ways of being contextual, right? I'm going to give you some examples here that are going to seem kind of crazy. It's like we're going to leave Castroville for a moment. I'm putting them not as a recommendation for what you should do, but to stimulate some thinking about how context can work in architecture, all right? So Houston, here's an example on the right of a building from the 1980s that is talking to a very typical Houston bungalow. And it does so through typologically specific forms. In this case, the pitched roof, and you see that up there. Of course, the big gable, the use of materials, the wood here, color as well, the kind of gray of the bungalow that was very typical of this neighborhood that the architect picks up here, right? Again, it's not a copy, the new building, of the old building, but it's one that expresses an awareness of its setting and of its site. It's taller, it is bigger, but it says, I know where I am, and I'm going to try to be there, right? Wellesley College, completely different part of the country. There's a new building, from 1958 building, right here, called the Jewett Arts Center, that was nationally admired when it was built because of how well it actually talked to the Collegiate Gothic building across the way on this hill. And it did it, again, not by looking like a Collegiate Gothic building with a bunch of pointy parapets or ogee arches or Gothic tracery, but by picking up materials and the certain forms and the patterns and the rhythms of the windows, and for helping define the hill where it sat and where its neighbors sat. And it did this, just to give you a sense, by creating this really quite amazing sort of entry, which celebrates the hill and the site even more than it would have been without it. And I give this to you as an example as you think about making Castroville even more wonderful, right? What can you do to encourage the specialness to sort of come out and be revealed so that when you come up out of this space framed by Jewett, by the new building, you turn and see this building, which of course is the heart of campus with the great tower there. And then to this point about patterns and materials, what Paul Rudolph, the architect, does here will acknowledge that there are these points that Gothic architecture is so famous for, but he's going to turn them into little skylights there, right? And there are going to be these very narrow windows, and the memory of tracery there then is present in the screens, okay? Again, very, very different than what you're dealing with, but I give it to you as an example of perhaps how architects can creatively respond, right, to historic conditions. Jerusalem, we're getting even farther away now, right? In Jerusalem in the 1920s, when the British are in charge, they make a rule that all new buildings have to be built in the same Jerusalem stone. And so what you get then is a city that has, wow, a lot of buildings in the same stone, but really tremendous variety in style. It was like they were still having the 19th century over here and the early 20th century, and then we're going to have the 1930s here, and there's the YMCA from the 50s, right? And so the effect is of, I mean, almost sort of startling uniformity on the one hand, but also sort of jarring juxtaposition on the other, right? And again, I just put this out there as a kind of test, kind of case study. In Brandenburg, which is just outside of Berlin, and maybe has more specific parallels to Castroville here, it's a town that I think manages scale really well, right? That there are these somewhat wide streets, but there are also sidewalks, and you see that many of the buildings, of course, are close to the sidewalk and to the street. And what's so striking to me here again is that not everything has to match, right? That you get, again, a kind of coherent, great townscape like what you have, right? But perhaps even a bit denser here without any kind of uniformity, even certainly of heights or materials. Athens, here we go. This is classicism and climate over the centuries, again, looking at a particular architectural element, in this case, the porch, the portico, or the balcony. And this might be, for example, if you had someone come to town and say, I'm going to be really contextual, and I'm going to take those porches, and I'm going to do porches in this new way over and over and over, just as an example. Also, I'm fascinated by this. I was in Athens for the first time this summer. I had no idea, maybe you know this, I did not. It is so much like the Hill Country. In Athens, you go up there on the Acropolis, it looks like the Hill Country, it smells like the Hill Country. They have agaves, right, up there. It's amazing. Anyway, the point is, we all know the Parthenon, right? Famous for its great portico, right, and the kind of porch that did exist. This is up here on the Acropolis with the Erechtheion right there, the Propylaea in the distance. So just hang on to that, okay, probably all familiar. That's 2,000 years ago, approximately, roughly. Well, it turns out in the 19th century, architecture looked really different, even here, at the base of the Acropolis. So the Parthenon is up there on the hill. You just come down, right? We see these really interesting and I think wonderful 19th century buildings, and now here come these little balconies, right? And there's this classicism that the architects will use with these cornice lines and these window frames, and it's sort of a subtle classicism, but it nevertheless is there. It's very fashionable in the 19th century. So that's sort of the mid-19th century. And then you just go down the block, and then you see in the 1930s that somebody's thinking about projections from the wall surface now in the form of these sort of bay windows that talk to the balconies just across the street, even as they're a few decades down. And then we keep going just a few more years, same street, and now the balconies come back in an explicit way, and they get longer, and they start to stretch across the whole of the building. And oh my gosh, there's a classical arch, a ruin. Wow, Athens is amazing, right? And there's some more of those little balconies. And then we go out from the kind of zone right around the Acropolis, And suddenly, it's really, the 1950s and 60s, and there are apartment buildings, and it's a zippy, dynamic, big, giant city. And now the apartment buildings have these balconies that run all the way along, and it is amazing. You see building after building, and they define entire blocks and define entire streets, these patterns. And so you follow it, and you follow it, and then you go around, and then you see this brand new townhouse, and it's this is a new, modern building, and it's got these little balconies again, and then you go and look at it right up close, and suddenly it makes sense in a whole new way, because you see the piers with the concrete there, the exposed concrete, and you can see the patterns from the formwork, from the wood, and it makes sense because you've been to the Acropolis, right? To see this architectural language as somehow a descendant of this one. Now, Athens is a special place and case study for all of this, but all to say, I hope that, part of their conversation will be at least to consider what really smart, great architects can do if they are thoughtful and if they are engaged and if they have a client who is a really great partner, as I know you all are prepared to be in creating and shaping the future. For all of this about classicism, you might, though, turn around and say, but there's another Athenian tradition, and that is the tradition of Byzantine architecture in this city. And this is just one of the many Byzantine churches. This is one from the 12th century. And you see the details, and it involves this wonderful brick and variegated pattern on the wall surface there, and these fabulous arches, right? These voussoirs, that's what we call these, the bricks that go around there. And then in the 1950s, this architect, Dimitris Pikionis, has to design really a kind of renovation for a church from the 1600s, and that's the language that he's going to pick up on, right? Again, the point here is there are different histories, and every place has histories that can be mined that are maybe not the ones that first come to your brain when you're thinking about it, right? That you have a range of choices and possibilities. So, there are many ways of being contextual, right? And it is the context of the Studebaker carport that is the Alsatian house. It is the Alsatian Fachwerk of the bakery. You're already doing this, right? It's about putting into words what's working, what you love, what you want to keep. Anticipate the future, shape the town, and use your strengths. That's what I would say. Tourism, probably more of it is coming because it seems to be coming everywhere. There are hotels with and without character, as you know very well. The one on the left is one of the two buildings is owned by the Hotel d'Orphée in Regensburg, Germany, which is a delightful little town. And you can see, these are 4-story buildings. They've got gables there. They have ground level retail, which is really nice. And wow, they come right up to the sidewalk there, and they even have terraces. And of course, we would probably rather stay there than at the Hampton Inn. This is their other building, right? They have these 2 buildings that are part of the same hotel. And it's a very tall building relative to certainly the Castroville standards at the moment, but it works beautifully, right? In terms of defining the context. And there you see this window, right? The bay window that comes out. And they have done wonderful things with the interior. And I'm, thinking about this very room that we're in. To the extent that you can, nurture these interiors, right? Take good care of them. They're as important, and they're part of what make being in these historic places so wonderful. That's the point there, right? Okay, here's another example. This is a hotel in Belgium. Again, it comes right up to the street, same sorts of things that we're talking about 4 stories with a gabled roof, and again helps define the space of the city and has this wonderful little outdoor cafe right there. Again, the dining outside, I suspect, is not going to go anywhere, right? Mostly because it's fun, and certainly because here we can do it for so much of the year. You have, of course, the tradition already. You have two great historic hotels that can be kind of templates, right? Do more things like this, right? As we go forward, and it need not be the Hampton Inn. Where would you rather eat? Right? I mean, fried chicken, I'm all for fried chicken. This is not about fried chicken, this slide. Do you understand? Right? Okay. But I'm pretty sure I know where you'd rather eat, right? Okay? And again, it's looking at the siting of the building, the context, the adaptive reuse that the Conservation Society is supporting so firmly, and thinking about really the relative status of cars. And you're going to have a big conversation about cars at some point in all of this, because they get driven and they get left and they need to be parked. And I don't think that there's any place that can think about the future without thinking about parking and what you're going to do about that. Growth, as we think about growth, this is Bradford-on-Avon in England. Towns can combine cars and pedestrians, businesses and homes. This is a wonderful town, primarily from the 18th century, although there are older parts as well. And as you can see, it's got all these characteristics that we've been talking about, variety of forms and styles and colors, and indeed a palette of materials that varies. And it even has cars. And it has wide sidewalks for pedestrians here on this side. And again, you have this, this heritage already of doing what we call mixed-use buildings, right? That is a building that might have a shop or a restaurant on the ground floor and have living space, apartments, maybe a townhouse of some sort, right? On other parts of the building, either above or to the side, right? That's a type that is actually much more typical throughout the history of architecture than a detached single-family house, and certainly one that Henry Castro would have known very, very well. Commerce, again, back to Brandenburg, it's more fun to shop in town than in a shopping center, in large part because you don't have to walk through a big, giant parking lot, right? And so, again, when you think about what town means, right, and supporting urban or supporting civic life, right, as opposed to spaces for vehicles, that's part of what we're talking about. And there are some of your shops, right? All right, and then here again, just yet another example from Greenwich, right, of buildings of different types and heights and styles that make for a very vibrant townscape and community, which is part of your roots already, right? Different buildings, different heights, different types. So to wrap up, I hope that you will think of planning as a form of stewardship, right? Mayor Schroeder alluded to this at the very beginning, that Castro's sense of care, his sense that he was doing something important, was intimately bound up to his instincts to plan and to invite the best builders that he could find to shape this town. I think that thinking about stewardship and planning means asking really big questions of yourselves as a community. What are the values and principles that have given rise to the qualities of Castroville that you prize the most? I've given you some suggestions about what those are in terms of form and in architecture, but there's going to be a lot more that only you know. What should remain constant? What can't change for this to still be Castroville? What can be even better? It's not perfect, no place is. What can be even better? Who are you preserving or building for? Right? And this is so, so critical. Who is the Castrovillian of 2030, not very far away, of 2050, of 2100, of 2122, when we are all gone? Who is here? How do they live? What have we left? That's what stewardship is. It is the long game, the long view. And you all, boy, you all really know this, right? Because many of you have family that go really way back, right? 100 years is short for you. Going forward, okay. Castroville is a town on the Medina River that prizes its history and patronizes well-designed buildings that support local living, working, and community life. I would urge you to be cautious about what we call historicism, right? That is people who are going to come in and say, oh, you love your buildings? I'm going to give you a copy of them. That's not forward, that's backward. That's different from honoring the town and honoring the traditions, right? And that's, again, where nostalgia and uniformity, you have to be very, very careful. And it's harder to design variety if you're starting out, right? But it's really important to have it be a value, I think. I would encourage your city council and whoever else is empowered legally to do this to write design guidelines that are flexible enough to allow for creative, thoughtful approaches to context, yet specific enough to ensure continuity, the continuity of the character of Castroville. And that's part of what I mean about becoming a great client, becoming the partner with your architects, with the developers. Get them on your team. Make them believe. Right? And I know this is part of what we're doing, trying to get this vocabulary out there and have people connect with it and understand it and use it. Empower Design Review Committee to rigorously critique proposals, right? I'm a professor, I'm a humanist, I believe in critique. I think that things get better when we criticize them from a position of good faith, right? And to the extent that you all can engage in that in a really productive, honest way with yourselves and with the people who come here, you're going to get better architecture. And partner with architects and developers to help them learn to see Castroville through walks, multiple site visits, and examinations of representative examples. There is no substitute for walking the streets, as you know, right? Make them come and learn this place. Make them take the time to learn your best buildings, to touch them, to take pictures of them, to sketch them, whatever it is, because that's how then they become engaged and you bring them onto your team and become partners. So I will stop here and we can talk further if you like, but congratulations on your journey. Sure. So so the question was about O'Neill Ford, and I'm sorry if I didn't explain who he was. I didn't want to derail us onto an O'Neill Ford thing, but absolutely, it is a really important question. So O'Neill Ford was born in Denton, or actually Pink Hill, doesn't matter for our purposes, North Texas, and he comes and he travels in Central and South Texas as a very young man, and he goes to all of these little towns, including Castroville, and he just loves them, and he travels with his brother Lynn Ford, who was a marvelous artist, known really for his woodwork, and they sketch, and they write about what they see. And then he goes and he works for David Williams, this Dallas architect, for a few years in the 1930s. Ford comes to San Antonio really to design La Vita, to recreate La Vita as part of a program organized by Maury Maverick, who was then the mayor of San Antonio. And in the process, Ford gets very, very interested, even more interested than he had been, in the historic architecture of San Antonio, particularly the missions, and ends up, in fact, falling in love and marrying the daughter of the president of the Conservation Society, and so instantly gets very, very connected into the preservation world in San Antonio. And he will go on. I mean, his most famous project in San Antonio is the campus of Trinity University, where I teach, right, which he and his colleagues designed almost all of the buildings from the 1950s through the 1970s. And it's this amazing, intact, I mean, probably many of you have been to the campus, but it's a really special place, in part because of the site, because it's on this amazing hillside site. He and particularly his partner, working with his partner Boone Powell, designed the Tower of the Americas there for Hemisphere. But he was a huge advocate for saving buildings, for conserving buildings, for doing exactly what you all are doing. And I have to say, he would love to be here. I know this because I've read a lot of his writing, and I know one of his daughters really well. This is so much part of the story of the architecture of this state, this very evening, this very series that you're doing. And again, as a historian, I see this as as part of why this is special and important. But Ford, he is a huge advocate for place and for old buildings, but he is also really interested in new things, and he's really interested in new technologies and trying new things, and he becomes this really important mentor for a number, almost every architect over a certain age in San Antonio has an O'Neill Ford story, and his most famous pair of students are Lake and Flato of Lake Flato Architects, which is, some of you probably knows, a internationally regarded firm. In any case, he helps set the tone, really, for architecture in this part of the state in the 20th century. So.
So I'd ask anybody that has a question that would like to come up and ask it, please come right up here so that the people who are watching the video can also hear it. If you're not comfortable with asking the questions out loud, Martha has some pens and some paper. We'll get these out ahead of time next time, but if you're not comfortable with coming up and asking the question, please get with Martha and do that. Thank you.
Actually, I don't have a question, I have a comment. I just want everybody to know that from 4 miles high, Castroville is absolutely unique. It is unmistakable. Decades ago, we used to use Castroville as the anchor ground reference to keep our student pilots from getting lost. And I imagine they probably still do.
I was wanting to ask about the signage, more information about what that might look like.
Yeah.
I wanted to know more about the signage and what that might look like in Castroville.
So this question is about signage, and there are different ways of doing it, right? You could, again, have a city council say signs are this size and this color and this kind of typeface, this kind of lettering. That would be one way of doing it. And you actually already have a bunch of signs in Castroville on some of the historic houses that have the plaques. That's an example, you're already doing it, of saying, oh, I'm in Castroville, here's one of these historic houses I should stop and look at, right? And it does give a sense of uniformity. That's one way, right? Another way that might be, I don't know, maybe cooler, is to say, okay, this is what a sign can't be, to give more general guidelines and to encourage developers and commercial businesses to create signs that have certain specifications that don't all look the same, but that do get approved in some way, right? And that perhaps reflect, and this is the part I think would be cool, reflect the character of the business, right? Because again, you expect there to be different signs on different places, and I bet all of us, because we have lived in the 20th and 21st centuries, have a sense about that. I mean, everybody can picture, right, the neon Pegasus from Mobil Oil, right? I mean, and that's about branding on the one hand, and is maybe an example of what you're not going to want Shell to do. That was the example I gave you, but it's really great graphic design, right? And a part of what I guess I would say is to take the principles that you apply to the architecture and extend it to signage and say, let's have this be as well and appropriately designed for the space as we're asking the buildings to be, and understand it as part of the visual landscape as a whole. Is that, yeah?
Sorry. We have a neighborhood that's across the river over there.
Yeah.
That doesn't look like downtown Castroville. The buildings over there are much more varied and more like you might find in any 90s, early 2000s neighborhood. And the streets aren't laid out like downtown Castroville. So what would be your recommendations for addressing context when that's the part of Castroville that new development is going to be closest to and taking its strongest visual cues from if we don't do something?
It's an excellent question. There you have to decide how you feel about that newer development, about that part of Castroville. And I think is a conversation that only you can have about history, about the recent history of this town, and what gets to count in 2022, 2023, whenever you're really hammering this out about the parts of Castroville that we're going to pick up and take our cues from, right? I mean, I would hope that you take a big, wide, inclusive look at Castroville. And it's not going to be easy precisely because there is this variety, and you already have probably kinds of development that you would rather not have here, right? But to somehow pretend that it's not there isn't going to get you where you want to be, right? And again, I think that's where I might defer to an architect, to a planner who is going to have some ideas about how to make these connections. And I want to emphasize too, I'm here to sort of tell you what I see. I have tremendous respect for architects, as you probably can hear, because they really do. They have an amazing toolkit. They have amazing ways of seeing and understanding. And I would bring them into that. I would say that right out to them. Oh.
We have anybody else? Okay, there's one question that came in. So somebody asked, do you have any recommended reading or bibliographies, any further information that people can do some research on this?
Sure. Should I email that to you? Is that the best way to do that?
Yes, if that would be all right.
Yeah?
We'll do that. We'll make
I'd
sure
be
that we get
happy
that
to do
actually
that.
onto the video as kind of an appendices at the very end of the video.
Sure.
So people have to sit through the whole thing and watch the wonder here.
Or you could email it to your people on the list, right? Yes, I'd be happy to. No, yay, good. Yes, read. I'm all for reading. Good. There are some great sources out there. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Amazing.
Thank you. Good luck.
So I heard three things that really stand out, and no, Kyle, I am not going to give you another 5 minutes. She keeps me in line. I think she needs to go back on city council so she can kick me in. So I heard, I know where I am and I want to be here. I heard that loud and clear, and I think that that's the thing that we've got to encourage the people that are coming from the East to remember. They are where they are because of who we are, and they should honor that. They should find ways to be a part of Castroville. Don't drop yourself in the middle of Castroville as yourself. Do it as a part of the community. The other thing that I heard was honor the vernacular. Don't create cheap copies. So it's not about exact copies. It's about finding the elements. And hopefully we can find some encouragement. And the developers, to their credit, I think every one of them have asked us, what does that look like? And we haven't been able to tell them. And I think that with Kathryn's direction and with some of the resources that we're doing, I think that we'll be able to find that. The last thing that I heard was, if you criticize me, I get better. That's what I heard, yeah.
As my students, they get better.
So thank you very much for coming out. Please join us next week. We'll be here on Wednesday of next week. Same thing, 6:30 for kind of the happy hour, 7 o'clock for the actual seminar. It'll be about the same, about an hour. If there are ways that we can improve, please let us know. I did forget to mention, and I'm remiss in doing so, your county judge-elect and amazing musician who will be with us on Fiorella Friday, Keith Lutz, has provided the audio kind of last minute and done just a fantastic job for it, and he's always there for us. So thank you for being here in official capacity, in your heart capacity, and in your technical capacity. Yeah. Great. Thank you.